Hello, welcome to episode 8 of the Hope for Healing video podcast. I'm Dr. John Stracks. I'm joining you from my office in Chicago, and I'm here with my former patient and now good friend Jill Riddell, who's joining us from her vacation cabin up in northern Michigan.
Hi, John.
Hi, Jill. Glad you're here. Hope for Healing is a joint effort between me and the Curable app, which most of you are familiar with. For those who don't know one or the other, I'm a physician who's got a mind-body medicine practice in the Chicago area focused on the reduction and elimination of physical symptoms using mind-body medicine methods. Curable is an amazing app focused on the same goal. We've been working together since their inception about 5 years ago, and we started this series at the beginning of the COVID-19 epidemic, as we both thought about what we could do that would help support people in this trying time. And before I formally introduce Jill and we get started, there are two housekeeping items I want to go over. First of all, I want you to know that our office in Chicago has been able to expand our telehealth capabilities significantly since the COVID pandemic started. And we're also working on sustaining that indefinitely once the pandemic is over. And so no matter where you are, if you're feeling stuck with your symptoms, feel free to reach out to our office at www.drstracks.com. We can give you details about what it would look like to work with me directly about your situation. Secondly, just a quick note on terminology. So many of you who are listening know what we're discussing as mind-body medicine, which to me means that our body can express for us what's going on in our lives. And that's universal. It's not bad. It only becomes, quote, bad if you enter a medical system that doesn't understand this and assumes that all physical symptoms are physical in origin. I really believe that humans have always expressed our lives and our bodies and will always do that moving forward. And so our goal, my goal, Curable's goal, Jill's goal, is to help you understand more about that and to learn what to do about it so that when it happens, it's no longer physically uncomfortable or painful for you. Both Jill and I initially learned about this concept from a physician named Dr. John Sarno, who many of you have heard of as well. Dr. Sarno was a physiatrist in New York City in the 1960s who really understood the connection between mind and body and was the first one to really popularize this work. At that time, he coined the term tension myositis syndrome, or TMS, which is a term that I have used for years. Given now, though, that we have a much better understanding of the whole concept, we preferentially use the term mind-body medicine, but occasionally I slip and call it TMS. And so just note that no matter what I say and no matter what I call it, I'm referring to this concept, that what happens in our lives shows up in our bodies. And that doesn't make us bad and it doesn't make us sick. It just makes us human. So with that, let me introduce Jill. I first met Jill in late 2014 when she came to me suffering from 40 years of migraine headaches and was interested in taking a more holistic approach to her pain. She's done extraordinarily well since that time using mind-body medicine methods, having gone from roughly 200 migraines a year down to about 4. And she frequently speaks publicly to my patients about her experience, both individually and in groups. And she's such an inspiring speaker that I wanted you to have a chance to listen to her talk as well. In the real world, Jill's an adjunct professor of writing at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She writes stories and essays and articles. She's working on a nonfiction book about her quest to find a species of plant or animal that's never been seen before. She also runs the Office of Modern Composition in Chicago and is the host for the Shape of the World podcast, which she describes as being about cities, nature, and people. She lives on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park with her husband and during COVID, possibly her 2 delightful college-age daughters. She likes gardening, tennis, and talking, writing, and thinking about mind-body medicine. She and I have collaborated on some writing projects about this topic, and over the years, she's become a good friend. So Jill, thanks for being here on Hope for Healing with me.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. So you and I were talking a little bit before we got on. I do like to oftentimes start with a non-mind body medicine topic. So can you tell us a little bit more about the Shape for the World podcast?
Yeah, well, the shape of the world sort of came out of my long career in things related to environment and science. And I started off as an environmentalist thinking that wilderness was way over here and nature was way over there, and have spent this time living in the city of Chicago and really understanding how nature is all around us and inside of us and is us, and wanted to have a podcast about that. There's a lot of dire news about the environment, and rightly so. Not everything's going perfectly by a long shot, at the same time as there are things that have made great improvements in the environment as well, especially around nature and biodiversity in cities. And cities have become incredible places for finding nature and getting in touch with nature. And so I talk to people like the architect Jeannie Gang, who incorporates a lot of nature into the designs of her buildings. I'm actually working on editing her podcast episode right now. That's what I'll do after I get off the phone with you. And
She's a big deal. Good for you
yeah,
for getting her on the podcast.
yeah. I have David Sibley from this season, who has written all the bird guides, and just different people who talk about wildlife in the city, nature in the city, how to access it. And also, then we also just talk a lot about their lives too, and what it is to see the world in that way.
Nice. And how many years have you done it now? It's been a while,
It's my
right?
third season. Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm just completing the third season of it.
Nice. And Shape of the World, I think I botched the title earlier, but Shape of the World. And if people want to listen to it, they find it on iTunes?
Yeah. The usual spots.
Okay, good. Um, all right, so let's talk about mind-body medicine for a while. So you and I first met when you came to my office when I was working at the hospital at Northwestern, and you've been dealing with migraine headaches for many, many, many years at that point. Can you give everybody a sense of like what life was like for you leading up to that? Because you had gotten your first migraine when you were young, right?
Yeah. It was horrible,
Yeah.
basically. The migraine headaches I had for 42 years, I think, before I set foot in your office. So from the time I was 10 or 11, and it was the worst aspect of my life by far. I feel like they were, even if I didn't have a headache and wasn't in pain at that moment, my life was really organized around the possibility that I could have a headache at any moment. And so I needed to get something done right now, because who knew, like 3 days from now, I might be laid low by a headache. And yeah, it really monopolized a lot of my thinking during that time. And it wasn't as though it was always steady. I mean, I did have some periods where they were lighter, less impactful on my life, and times when they were worse, but they were a consistent thing for over 40 years.
And in typical migraine symptoms, splitting headache, did you have auras and other sort of other pieces to nausea, vomiting?
Yeah, my experiences of not migraines was that for me, it felt like a malevolent weather system that would move in. Like it would be precipitated by pain in my head, but it was more than pain in my head. And specifically, the biggest symptoms I had were the headache itself. And then I would be sick to my stomach as well. And so nausea, headaches. Sometimes I would also almost feel even like I was getting like a tiny fever or something. I would feel that kind of achy sort of sensation. So it really was systemic. And I think that was one of the things that I always was confused by, and that I never got a good answer for. Was like, well, I have the pain up here and I'm calling it a headache. So why is my stomach also hurting? And like my chest is fine, my throat is fine, everything between my head and my stomach is fine. So what's going on with that? And then that was another way that the mind body medicine suddenly made sense of that it wasn't about a pain in my head.
Yeah, I remember the author, somebody wrote a nice book called The Headache in the Pelvis about just like, yeah, that like we call it a headache because it's there, but it's the same process that's going on all over our body. And so this had been going on for 40 plus years in you, you had tried a variety of medications. Was that the primary
Oh,
treatment that you had tried leading up, or you had done a lot of other things as well?
yeah. The medications thing is just, now it seems funny to me, but at the time when you're in it and you're just struggling for any kind of help, it wasn't funny at all. So when I was young and at home, my parents both got migraines. And I think a big part of it was that they really modeled for me that having headaches was part of being an adult. And they would occasionally disappear into a dark room with cold pack on their head. And when I was an adolescent, I was like, okay, I guess I'm signing up for that same program. And something in my body just sort of triggered that I would start getting headaches too. And the medicine du jour of our household was Excedrin extra strength pain reliever. And I would wash it down with a Coca-Cola, which also had caffeine in it. I thought like getting that caffeine was somehow helping the headache. And then later I moved on I really didn't go to see a doctor about my headaches. Again, I think my parents also just sort of viewed them as inevitable so long as I was living at home. But then as a young adult, I started, if I was seeing a doctor about something, I would ask about the headaches. So I had a variety of things over that time. Um, let's see, what was on the list? I had some prophylactic medicines, like I tried a beta blocker for a while, something to lower blood pressure for a while. Um, in 2010, when they had gotten really bad, I remember one doctor had recommended messing with the hormone levels, like maybe taking estrogen. I didn't do that. There was also an anti-seizure medication that was recommended that I never took for it. And I tried all kinds of alternative medicines. So in my 20s, or I guess in my early 30s, I started doing acupuncture and Chinese herbs in a really serious way. Spent a lot of appointments there, a lot of money on that. And they really didn't make my headaches any better. I really liked my acupuncturist and I felt very calm going there. And I felt like I was doing something good for my health by going there, but it didn't change my headaches. I still got the headaches just as much as ever. And other things that were recommended and I tried were chiropractic massage, shiatsu massage, energy healing. Um, I also read in a yoga magazine one time that it said that the color green is good for migraines. So I spent this time period trying to look at trees more, or if I was in a room and I felt a headache coming on, I would stare at somebody's, lime green throw pillow on their couch, hoping that that was going to cure my headache. And it might surprise you to know it actually did not cure my headaches, but it sounded good.
Yeah. I want to double back for 1 second. And so your parents both got migraines and you got migraines. And so it felt like sort of an inevitable happening for you. People ask me regularly, like, how genetic is this? And so do you have any thoughts, or have you had thoughts over the years about that question? Like, how much of this could have been genetic versus learned versus something else?
Well, the fact I could get rid of them by going through the cures involved in mind body medicine made me think it wasn't genetic, because if it was genetic, I'd still have them, right? I mean, my DNA hasn't changed.
Mhm. Yeah, your DNA has not changed. Now, interestingly, and you may know, do you know much about epigenetics? Do you know that term?
Yes, that idea that your DNA does record some events and environmental factors from parents and grandparents and ancestors, that does change the DNA a little bit, or gives it.
It doesn't change the DNA. Your DNA remains your DNA over time. But what happens is that the DNA strands get in the chromosomes, they get marked in various ways. And then how you express your DNA is different. And so like you may be, not you, somebody may be prone to cancer, say, but if they eat really healthy and they exercise regularly and they live a clean life, they're much less likely to get cancer than somebody who's eating processed foods all the time, living next to, say, like toxic waste dump. And so we really nicely over the last 10, 15 years, we found this concept that like our DNA is not our destiny, because there's a lot that goes on in our lives that changes how we express our genes and our chromosomes. And so it's actually really nice for the kind of medicine I practice to know that, like, even if we're prone to certain diseases, there's nothing that says that we can't change our destiny that way and do something different. And so, yes, your DNA has not changed, but the way you express your DNA may have a little bit. And so I've been talking a little bit about this because I've been telling some of my patients in the last week or two that you and I were going to have this conversation that they could watch in a couple of weeks when we release it. And it's one of the things that we end up talking about is like, is there just genetic component to migraines? And I say, I don't think anybody's destined to get migraine headaches. But what I say, and I think I've probably said to you before, is that, like, I think there's always been a place in society for the people who knew that the storm was coming, because like they're sensitive enough that they can sense the change in the weather, or they know somehow that the neighboring town is getting ready to invade, and it sort of shows up in people's heads. They get this physical warning that something is going on. And in our society, we've kind of labeled that as migraine and we've called it something bad, but I'm not sure that it always is or was. And so I have a sense that maybe like you and your family are actually kind of good at knowing what's going on in the world around you. And if you and I lived in a town in Central Europe 550 years ago, it may have been great to have your family around to know like what was going to happen before it actually happened. These days, it's sort of like, we call it migraine and we treat it with medication and everything else. But I talk with a lot of my migraine patients about that possibility, that what shows up as migraines is part of their sensitivity and their ability to kind of see and notice what's going on in the world.
That's interesting. It's both an attractive idea to me and also sort of a dangerous one, in that I think that's a lot to put on somebody with a migraine, that they're the barometer for a social system. I don't know. I think a lot of my thinking around it has been rotating around, in part from my thinking a lot about science and nature, which is that I know that human beings are intensely social animals. And that is the source of why our intelligence has been so much more effective in altering the world, for better and for worse, than any other mammal or cephalopod or any of the other intelligent animals that are on the planet, is that we learn from one another. So if you have a tool and I see you using that tool, I'm like, oh, that's a cool tool. I'm going to make myself one of those. And then I think of something else I could do with it. And somebody over here sees me doing that, and then they imitate that. So we grow from learning from one another. Far and away, that's our advantage over other species on the planet. And I just think we're extremely influenced by the actions and behavior of the people around us. And I mean, that's been tracked in things that you wouldn't think that would have any kind of a communal component at all. So even things in terms of people's weight, that we tend to try to sort of match the weight of the people that are around us. I think that we also tend to try to match the intelligence or wit of the people around us. If we're with a group of people who are really firing on all the cylinders, it sort of ups our game a little bit. Or we really adapt to fit in with whomever we're with. And I think in the world that I was modeling myself on, or the world that I was sensitive to, was a much smaller world than the world, capital W. I think it was the world of this little house in the country with the 3 other people that were living there with me. And, they had headaches, and in solidarity, I had headaches too.
Kids want to fit in. They want to do what everybody else is doing. And just
so
to be
do adults.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And just to be clear, like, I was not suggesting that people with migraines need to save the world. I'm not putting that on you. So by the time you and I met, you were having what, like 3-4 headaches a week? Is that kind of what the pattern was like?
Yeah. It was really bad. I really think that period had started a few years before I even saw you. I think about around 2010, they started getting really bad. And I'd gone to see like 3 a day. And I will say now that I understand the relationship to stress, which I didn't at all at the time, I perceived myself as somebody who didn't suffer from stress because I felt like I had a lot of advantages that sort of gave me not the right to feel stress. So therefore I didn't. So if doctors did ask me about stress levels, I'd be like, no, I'm good. Don't have any of that. What's that? I went to, but at that time I was working full time, running exhibits for a natural history museum and had a pretty big staff with that and all the attendant things that happen when you're part of a big organization like that and in a responsible position. And then I'd also retained a part-time job that I had teaching creative writing to graduate students at the School of the Art Institute. So I had those 2 jobs. I had 2 young children who were school-age children and a husband who had recently changed jobs also from the not-for-profit he had started and had started a business working on something related to climate change. And my parents were aging and I was the go-to person for them. And so in retrospect, I guess you could say I did have stress. But that was the time that I got to a doctor who prescribed Maxalt for me, which was a kind of rizatriptan. And that actually worked well for me. So I had relief from my headaches during that time period until I saw you a few years later. But the problem was that the pills were very expensive. They were like $30 a pop. So insurance doled them out judiciously. And they weren't a pain reliever or a narcotic. So I really didn't have any kind of negative side effects for it. So it really wasn't anything that I needed to avoid using for health reasons necessarily. So therefore I was just down with it. Like, oh, great. I can get rid of a headache in 2 hours instead of an entire day or losing 2 days, maybe even to it. That was awesome. And that's how I know, though, exactly how many headaches I was having was because I would get 9 of those a month and I needed all 9 of those in a month. And really I needed 10 wouldn't have the 10th and would get nervous near the end of the month. So I had a lot of anxiety around that medication at that time too.
Yeah, so that's 120 migraines a year at least, if not more. It's funny that you mentioned that about the stress because there are definitely times where people come into my office and I meet them the first time and I always ask people about stress. And there are times where I ask and they say, no, my life's pretty good. And something makes me say, like, if your wife or your husband, like if your partner was here and I asked them if there was stress, what would they say? And people generally laugh. And so then, all right, in my memory, either the first time we met or maybe you told me this afterwards, or maybe I'm just totally making this up, but in my memory, you had said at some point, like early, maybe in 2014, like this was the year you were gonna heal your migraines. And you and I talked in November. So you had gone through a lot of the year, among other things. I think you had taken a mind-body medicine, or not a mind-body medicine, a mind-body stress reduction course. But do I have that right, that sort of like you had made this pledge at some point that the migraines were going to end?
Right. I mean, I had made that pledge plenty of times before, frankly, but they really were just awful. And I went to see a colleague of yours at Northwestern, who was my general practitioner, and went in there resolved to have one more conversation about migraines. And I mentioned to her that I was taking this mind-body stress reduction class. It was essentially a meditation class. And it just as a sort of on a side, I mean, it did change my relationship with the pain, but it didn't make the pain go away. I still had the headaches at the same frequency, but I just felt better about it. And not just better about it. I felt like I had a little more, that I was a little bit more of an agent in it, that I had some agency and some ability to control my way I've reacted and responded to the pain. That did make the situation better, even if it didn't get rid of the pain. And so when I mentioned that I was taking that class, she was like, oh, well, we could try this. I think she was actually the one that was talking about the anti-seizure medication as a possible prophylactic. And I was like, she wrote out the prescription actually and said, you can decide whether you fill it or not, but it might help, if you want to try it, here it is. And she said, I have a colleague, Dr. John Stracks, who works with mindbody, and you might want to set up an appointment with him. And so thank goodness I did that. Like, I mean, it seemed, I mean, honestly, now that I know you, it sounds sad to say this, but at the time I thought, well, this will be hopeless. It's just one more thing, but okay. And, but then I saw you just a few weeks after that. That was the appointment that I came in, and I remember what I'd said to you. I said, I want to get 20% better. I would like, instead of having a headache once every 3 days, if I could have a headache once every 4 or 5 days, that would be amazing. And if I could just reduce it by 20%, I would consider that a huge success. And I had come in with my journal, because every doctor always says, well, you need to keep track of when you get the migraines and what you're doing when you get the migraines and what you've eaten and how you've exercised and, whether you got sleep and all of this sort of thing. And I'd been doing that for a long time, not absolutely every day, but intermittently. And I had to have these periods where I would take everything bad, quote bad, off the list of no cheese, no chocolate, no wine, no alcohol, no caffeine, no sugar, no dairy, no gluten, anything that was sort of in whatever, the zeitgeist of car culture was at that time of what bad foods were. I would remove them all at once sometimes and then track the results. Sometimes I would just do one at a time and try to see what I was reacting to. And I hoped I would get 20% better. And I told you that. And I said, but I remember one of the things I said in that was, I was like, but I do know one thing that's a trigger is alcohol is definitely a trigger. And I felt really proud of myself for having figured that one out. And I said, if I drink, I definitely get a headache. And you said to me, you go, whoa, well, you got kind of interested in that. Like, oh, how often do you drink? I was like, well, I don't drink. I haven't had a drink in 18 years. And you're like, oh, but you still get headaches.
It's funny because
It's so deflating. Oh, right.
In my memory, and I don't know if this is just like it's become lore in my mind over the years, talking to you and hearing you talk, but in my memory, like you brought in your list of triggers and you had like 18 triggers or 22 triggers and you gave it to me and I was like, I think like in your impression, I was like, huh, that's interesting. Like threw it over my shoulder.
It was totally like that. Like, it was like, oh, that's sweet that you've been keeping track of all those completely inconsequential pieces of data. That is really sweet. And I mean, you didn't say anything like that, but I definitely have the sense that I was on the wrong track and you had a different track in mind. And I remember that after I said that about the alcohol, you're like, oh, you'll be able to have a glass of red wine again. Picking the one thing that's always on the number one cause of migraines, red wine. I think but it was something about your doing that sort of shook me free of the narrative that I'd had. And that was when you said something that this was the phrase that really changed my life. I'm actually going to write it down exactly. I wrote it down exactly the way you said it to me at that time, because that was the point at which I really started getting better. But it was in that first appointment that you said, your pain is real, but you're not sick. There's nothing wrong with your head. And it seems in retrospect like I should have known that, or somebody else should have said that to me. But all my conversations with every other doctor and every little bit of the narrative that I had spinning in my head was, what's wrong with my head, right? What's wrong specifically with like this part of my head where I really get the headaches? And I would intermittently decide for sure it was a huge tumor. Never mind that I'd had it for forever and it was always been the same. And like, no, this time, like definitely, there's really something gone wrong. And then I would think it was also like something I was doing. So I had a lot of guilt around like, oh my gosh, maybe it's because I ate something that had sugar in it at 4:30 and because the headache came on by 6 o'clock, or oh, maybe it was this and maybe it was that. And so I had a lot of guilt and shame that maybe I was doing something wrong. Because frankly, the literature tells migraine sufferers they're doing something wrong. you know?
There's so much of that, and medical education is taught in the sense that like here's how people get sick and this is what's done to make them better. And so there's just not a very good model in the medical world for sort of honoring people's strengths and seeing their health. And I sort of am lucky by, I think, both nature and training that I've learned to do that. But it's hard to enter into anywhere in the system where somebody can sort of say that to you. Like, I don't really think that you're sick. And then there's a lot of blame that goes on in just sort of like what you learn and what you're talking about. I hear it from my patients regularly that like physicians and practitioners will blame them too, and it hurts my heart when I hear that, because like I can't think of anything that somebody who's not feeling well needs less than to hear that like they're doing it wrong, and that's why it's not working.
Right, or that they have a bad habit, and I think that's why I eliminated alcohol, frankly, was because it was the clearest thing that's a bad habit. It was because I didn't smoke. There were a lot of things that are on the list of health things, like, well, that's, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and I think that hearing that, like, oh, maybe it's because you're eating cheese, it's like, oh, excellent, I'm going to be an even better person from now on. I won't eat cheese.
Yeah. And right. And I hear people say that about migraines or other things too, like don't eat cheese, don't eat sugar, but it's not like the physicians are there like eating a vegan diet and sort of being pillars of health. And so it's all this kind of like challenge to do things that are super hard, as if like you should just whip it off and live without all those 18 triggers and everything else.
Right. And I think, and so for me, that whole concept that I wasn't sick was really revelatory. And it was in a way for me to redefine who I was, because I felt I was sick. I felt like a headache is a sickness and a stomach ache is a sickness. And I get those, and I get them often. And therefore, a third of the time, I'm a sick person. And it was really tied in with my identity. And I know that I let it hold me back from a lot of things that I wanted to do or participate in. It was really detrimental in so many ways. And I just think, even though I was functioning well in so many ways, the fact that I was often functioning well while experiencing a really bad headache was hard. I think
Yeah.
anyone with a chronic pain like that, like you have those experiences where it is really terrible and you do manage to get yourself off to crawl into a hole for a little while until you feel better. But there's tons of time when you have some kind of a chronic pain that you're just doing what everyone else is doing, but you're doing it with that chronic pain at that moment. You're sitting in the same meeting as everyone else and you have a migraine.
Yeah.
And so like that additional burden of always, of so frequently having to do all the ordinary activities that I still had to do, but doing them while in my mind I was sick.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you and I met that first time, and I think we probably talked about joining my class, and it was late in the year, and so we may not have had one until January anyways. But did you break your foot after that? Like I have my
Yes.
memory that something happened after
Yes.
that.
So I went out to Vermont to see a favorite young cousin in his senior high school play. And I slid on a mountain. It was already snowy there. And so I badly injured my leg. But it was interesting that because I had seen you and I had taken Dr. Schubner's book. So after I saw that appointment, I got Dr. Howard Schubner's book, Unlearn Your Pain, that was available at the counter at the office in Northwestern. On my way out, I bought that one. And You Can't Find Anything Wrong with You by David Clark. So I was reading those books. I started reading those books immediately. So there were a couple months between when I saw you and when I joined your class. And in the meantime, I had this trip where I injured my leg. But even that, like I was able to control the way I felt about that pain. Like I was like, oh, but it's only a pain in my leg. There's only one thing wrong. I don't have to let it affect all my other parts. Like every other part of me is working just fine. And so even then I had this little breakthrough of how I handled that injury.
Yeah. And then was it that January that you took the class with me?
Yes, it was that January when I took the class with you, and I just responded right away, I think, to those. I was really ready and hungry for that change of narrative of why I was sick, and really eager to understand it better. And I did the exercises, you would assign things in the class, and um, as a teacher myself, I always hope that everybody does everything exactly the way I want them to do it, and that gains the maximum amount. And I kind of, to be honest, was a little bit half-assed about how I did the assignments. I would kind of write the thing I was supposed to write, but sometimes my attention would be caught by something else in the book, and I might work on that. So I guess that was one thing I just like always to tell people is you can do this work extremely imperfectly and have it be highly successful. And that was my experience and the conversations with the other people in that group at that time, and coming in and there was something about making that effort, having that intentional time. That was, I think, an hour or 2 hours once a week, and coming in to do that for 6 weeks straight was really great. And I started to have these different visions of my pain that I could work with and handle. And I started to be able to create things that I could think through in my mind when I would feel a headache coming on. And yeah, and just learned a whole new set of skills through that process.
Yeah, that was a really fun class too. Like 3 of you in there are some of my most successful patients ever, including I think Jessica Dixon, who was the
Jessica.
first Hope for Healing
That's
guest. So whatever we did, like we need to somehow go back and bottle that so we can pass
right.
it out to
Well,
everybody.
I think you have. I think you're probably doing that in all your classes now.
It, oftentimes I will use you as an example anonymously, of course, but I say that, you took the mind body stress reduction class earlier that previous year, and that it had really set you up nicely, even though that didn't make the pain better, that it had sort of put you in a space. But actually, as I'm listening to you talk, like that was just a little piece of it, because you had a lot of other skills that you brought in. And so sometimes I think of people as being super saturated, which is an old chemistry term, where the solute, I think, is dissolved in the liquid, but it's like over dissolved. So all you need to do is add like one more drop and it all comes out, and it happens very quickly. But do you have a sense, like, there are patients of mine who have been working on this for a long time and very slowly get better. And you made a lot of progress very quickly. Looking back, do you sort of have a sense, in addition to the MBSR class, what else about you had set you up to be able to understand this very quickly and very intuitively?
Well, I had reached a place in my life where I understood the importance of narrative and the fluidity of narrative and how many different takes there are on the same story, and had become more suspicious in a really good and kind of playful way with whatever the dominant narrative was. Like, oh, that could be that way. And let's talk about the 5 other ways it could be too. And so I think that I wasn't somebody at that point in my life who was completely locked into thinking that I knew everything there was to know about myself, and that I knew everything there was to know about my family, and that I knew everything there to know about societal stressors, and that I knew everything about what it was like to be a young female person growing up in the late 20th century, and starting to understand those social pressures in a different way, being like, huh, that was going on. Well, that was pretty messed up. Rather than thinking at the time, like, oh, this is just the way the world works, and it's a great world, and everything's fine. So I was less willing to continue the propaganda machine, and to support the propaganda machine that had been given by the dominant culture, and by the folks around me. And, there are things that were valuable in that, and valuable lessons. I mean, actually, I think that denial of problems actually is an effective tool. It can be a great tool at certain times. What the problem is if you look in your toolbox and that's the only thing sitting there.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're going to need more than a hammer. You know, a screwdriver would be nice and some Allen wrenches would be pretty good. And it wouldn't hurt if you had a box cutter in there and, you know, some magnets and a few other things. And so I think that's what I was left with, as like the buck up and suck it up was pretty much the only thing I had in my back pocket to pull out.
I've in the past, I've asked you the flip side of that question, which is because you took to it so quickly and so intuitively, like in my mind, I was listening to you talk one time. I was like, why did it take 42 years to recognize that? And I don't even know if you remember this. One of the things you talked about was sort of getting far enough away from kind of the way your family dealt with it, which essentially was to have a migraine. Like that was part of the family business, was to have migraines. But does that ring true to you at this point, that like that it took a while to get out of the system where that was the correct response into a different system where there were other responses? Or
I think that it helped for me to be able to take a more critical look at my own wonderful parents and see the other sides of them. As they aged, those sides became more apparent in a certain way, more obvious for me to be able to observe. And I had just become more flexible and looser. There's something about having kids that makes you realize, oh, they can be raised a whole bunch of ways and be okay. And, you know, parents, and sort of that made me look at my parents in a different way. Yeah, I don't know exactly. It's hard for me to pin down what that was. But I do think it had a lot to do with story. And as a writer, I understand story. And it's been something where I've both been going at it in a cognitive kind of way and in a formal study of story and narrative, and also this personal study of my own narrative. And those two things have informed each other, sort of an informal study and the formal way of looking at things. So because I had that, I think it made me more receptive to the idea. I mean, basically what you did is you like totally blew my boat out of the water, right? I mean, you know, that I could easily have exploded and knocked all the papers off your desk and stormed out of there, right?
which has happened, which has happened.
Well, I would like to hear some of those someday. But
my record was 30 seconds. 30 seconds into an appointment one time.
Wow.
Yeah, not this kind of appointment, but that's happened.
So I think, it was the right thing coming to me. Actually, I could have used it probably 10 years before that. I was probably far enough along that I could have. I do feel like I would have been receptive to it earlier. But I definitely think the fact that I wasn't somebody that I knew at this stage, I was an adult, and I knew that human beings write the stories and human beings construct the narratives. They don't exist in time and space just as they are, as a fixed entity. And, it's up to you to claim your own story and to understand it and to interpret it and to change it. And you may have different ways that you're looking at it at different times in your life. And I was ready for a story in which I was not a sick person.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me too, what you had said earlier about us being such social animals. And so like wanting to be in the group. And, by the time you came to me, as you said, like you had your own life, you had your own family. You and I were talking before we got on a little bit about my patients who are like late 20s, early 30s, and just sort of starting out into that new life. And I do think that pressure, maybe not the right word, but just like wanting to fit in, if you come from a place where like illness is part of the narrative, like it is a very brave and bold step to move out of that. You're saying that like you'd had a fair amount of time to sort of practice that and get ready for that. I think some of my patients are like trying to figure out how to like compress that process and move out of it very quickly. And I think it's hard and scary, probably.
And maybe not necessary. Maybe their path is going to be a little more circuitous and soft and a sandy bottom stream winding its way. And that's okay. I mean, it doesn't have to be moving from A to Z and skipping all the LMNOPs. It's all right if it's slow and And the more gentle you can make that process, the better. You deserve gentleness. You deserve a gentle path.
Yes. Yes. Everybody deserves kindness and gentleness, and especially when they're not feeling well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're, go ahead.
I think that you probably have people, maybe even the person who walked out of your office at 30 seconds, where a little something entered in that maybe changed a little bit, entered a little bit of doubt about what their dominant narrative is. And then you just kind of play around with that and travel with that question a little bit, and something else adds to it and something else adds to it. So for some people, I happen to be in your office at the moment where you were that lightning bolt for me that made me see something in a completely different way. Maybe for other people, sometimes that you're a gentle little nudge, a little contour along the way, and the lightning bolt happens at some other time in some other way. It's hard to know.
Yeah. I like that idea though, because there's a lot of people put a lot of pressure on themselves, and then like they work on it and they struggle and they're not getting better, and then they start like self-shaming because they're not better. And so I love what you're saying, that like the gentleness and the gradualness is okay.
I like to say one thing that I about this is that I think that this cure, this mind body medicine cure, is the only thing I ever did that didn't have any negative side effects. So every medicine you take has some little zinger to it that's probably doing something that's not quite so great. Like the Max Salt that I liked so much actually did make me feel a little bit loopy. It felt like my brain wasn't functioning exactly the same way that it did. It wasn't bad, but it was a little bit that way. It also had the bad side effect of costing money and the anxiety around it and these other things that accompanied it. I think that, the acupuncture really did drain my bank account of many thousands of dollars over that period of time. I had to drive a long way to see that acupuncturist. And it's just part of the process, and I don't regret it in the sense that I think I was taken or it was anything bad. But the thing about mind body is that the major side effect of it is that you get to know yourself a lot better. And I really do believe in that edict from the ancient Greeks that the whole purpose of life is to know thyself. And by knowing yourself, you understand more about the human condition and about the meaning of life and all of these things. So there's all these beautiful things that come along with doing this work, and no bad side effects.
Yeah, I was talking with a patient about that yesterday, that sort of that exact topic. And he said, like, he's still trying to sort it out for him. It had only been a few weeks, but he recognized exactly that. Like, so I learned some more about myself and relationships, and like, how bad can that side effect be?
Right. So even if you didn't end up getting rid of your pain forever instantly with a lightning bolt, it's great because you're learning more. Yeah. And that's what we're here on earth to do. So
yeah. So, okay. So you took my class and I think you'd already started getting better even by the time you got there. But can you talk a little bit about what you noticed sort of in that time period after you and I talked, and what happened to the migraines over, say, the next like 6 or 12 months?
Yeah, I actually can. I actually, when I was getting ready to talk to you today, I looked back at the class. I remember I even said something to you like, I want to be one of your big successes when I came in to meet you. And I didn't even know that you had things that were success panels that people talked about. And you're like, oh yeah, you'd probably be able to talk on success panel by maybe April or something like that. It was like a few months away. I was like, wait, what? That really is a thing. But I did, in fact, talk on a success panel, like just a couple months after I finished that first class. And so I used my records from Walgreens to track the number of pills that I had taken. And at that point, using the Walgreens record, I'd wanted to have 20% fewer by April. So that was 6 months from when I'd first seen you in November, and only a couple months after the class. My headaches were 84% better.
It's amazing.
I was taking, a 16% as much medicine as I was taking before. And then the other thing that had happened is that it had this unexpected benefit in that it cured everything else that was wrong with me that I hadn't even thought was wrong with me because I was so focused on the headaches. Like I was having a gallstone attacks, a gallbladder attacks, and had been told I needed to have my gallbladder out. And here I am several years later with my gallbladder still working just fine. And those were terrible. I would get up in the middle of the night with just excruciating pain. I had had foot pain, weirdly, that just went away. I was getting up in the middle of the night a lot with these kind of weird digestive distress attacks and spending some time awake, just feeling uncomfortable. I'd been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome when I was maybe in my 20s, and kind of something that had been intermittent but had been bad during this time period building up to it. And my digestion had just moved to being pitch perfect. And it was just, yeah, so I had this whole other set of things that disappeared during that time period. And I should say too, it doesn't mean, so that was like the first 6 months, an extraordinary difference. At this point now, I do still feel migraines coming on. I've had a lot of luck with either just taking a couple of Advil and they're going away. I've also had good luck with filling a prescription bottle that I got for you when I actually got this prescription bottle from you when I had to take doxycycline because I'd had a tick that I was worried it was Lyme disease. So I got like this 1 dose of doxycycline. So I recycled that bottle and put a prescription label on it for a made up name for a drug that doesn't exist, but it looks super official. And I filled it with orange Tic Tacs, so they're the same flavor, the same color as Advil. And sometimes I will just take one of those and I'll be like, oh, I don't know if I should take this. This is really strong, and kind of hesitate over it the same way that I hesitate over taking the Max Salt. Like, oh, I just don't know, but maybe I really need it this time. I'm going to take it this time. And I've had a lot of luck of convincing my body like, oh, this is the thing we really respond to and feel better. And, oh, I see, like, you know, my prefrontal cortex, oh, it's paying attention to what the rest of us are saying, that we're in pain. Like, okay, we're all feeling better now. And almost like you treat a child, sort of like giving attention through taking pills. So I don't, so the Maxwell I maybe take, I've kept the prescription refilled. Like I've got a generous amount. I still carry it in my traveling kit and I still have it at home, but I take maybe 3 or 4 a year, something like that. And usually even then I take a half of one at a time, which I could never have imagined having done before. And also just the fact I don't even know exactly how many pills there are anymore would have been inconceivable to me 5 or 6 years ago.
And that's a nice point too, because, you know, we're talking earlier about sort of the pressure people put on themselves to get better. And so when people get better and are doing well, oftentimes if they get a migraine, then they're sort of back, like blaming themselves, feeling like they've done something wrong. But you still get them occasionally. You still take medication occasionally, and that's okay.
Right.
That's okay.
Right. And it's funny because I do realize, though, that the narrative around me, now that other people know that it's this mind-body connection, like I'll often have my husband say very anxiously, well, what do you think's causing this one? And and a certain anxiety, and kind of wants like a clear answer, like, oh, it was the conversation I had with this client, or he probably doesn't want to hear like, oh, it was the argument we had yesterday, or, you know, but I don't know, you know, I mean, it's not like I know exactly what it is. And I have worked out a lot of things that don't involve taking Tic Tacs or Max Salt to help with them. I have certain things that I visualize that help me calm down the headaches. And I have habits that I'll do, like I've described for you before, but I'll write down on a page, I'll turn a piece of paper kind of sideways and I'll make a circle in the middle of what I think is the stressor. And then I make little bubbles out from it, like, oh, I think it's this, but it's also related to this, which is also related to this. And so I won't necessarily write a whole big long thing about it. I do sometimes do MBS writing where I'm journaling too. But sometimes I'll just take a real shortcut and try to work it out another way.
And the visualization that you do, is there any one in particular that you do, or a combination? Like what's helpful in those moments?
There are a couple that I rely on, one of which I came up with when I was in your class, because we had a new puppy at home at the time who was a total whirling dervish of terror, just like this, like wild creature that was always on, always on, always on, and always frantic. And I think that I got that from the fact we had that puppy at that time. But I would picture my amygdala and my limbic system as being like this animal that was kind of all emotion, all responding to every little interaction with sort of fear, excitement, thrill, just constantly in an emotional state. And I started picturing my amygdala like this little wild animal. And I would think about, and that class was in the winter, so I would think about it kind of like climbing onto this little ledge in the back of my brain and lying down. And I pictured myself, another part of myself, covering it over with a little blanket and then snow falling gently on it, just cooling it down. And I would just think about my amygdala, like caring for my amygdala, putting it to rest, letting it cool off, and in this gentle, pretty snow. And that still works for me when I'm in that kind of a state where I feel like there's something really buzzing in my head that I just can't calm down. Another one that's good for me is I think about the fact that the same circuits in my body that carry pain, if I actually do hurt something like my leg sliding on a mountain, it's the exact same ones that hurt when I've had a bad conversation with the chair of my department at the School of the Art Institute or something. It's the same pathways. And so I just picture those pathways as being really hot and sort of all fired up and full of signals going back and forth rapidly. And I imagine there being on, like, as if my amygdala had these kind of wheels that could be like little crankshafts that I could turn and slowly close them down and ask my amygdala to close them down and just cool them down to this icy teal blue. And I just picture those circuits in my body as just calming down into this peaceful color, the color of sky and water and ice. And yeah, I'll just kind of take a quiet moment and picture that and imagine the pain circuits calming down.
That's nice. It makes me feel calm just listening to you talk about it. So these days, do you get, I'm trying to sort of, for people who are listening, it sounds like it's rare that you get what you consider a full-blown migraine, but it probably happens occasionally. But I think maybe you're describing that you get what starts to feel like the beginning of what a migraine used to feel like. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And at that point, you say to yourself, and kind of what you're just saying, and I'm thinking this through too, you say to yourself, like, okay, something's going on that I need to address one way or another. Is that, like, I'm just trying to sort of think through, like, what goes through your mind when this happens and sort of what people who are listening can take from your experience.
Well, first of all, I should probably be completely honest and say that my first reaction is identical to what my old reactions always were, which is a sense of panic and dread.
Yeah.
Oh no, I'm getting a migraine. I've got this to do. I cannot afford a migraine. However, I've gotten really good at letting that be a really short period of time because I'm so familiar with it now and now I know it. And it's kind of like, oh, that's happening. Okay. Well, so I don't let it spin out of control and become the only narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I still get it. So that's always my first feeling is just this feeling of dread and a little bit of shame, like, really? I thought I was done with that. I thought I'd moved past it and now I'm having a headache. So, I just bring some consciousness to that. And I'll just decide I'm just going to wait a little bit and see what happens. I don't really necessarily do anything right away. Generally, it happens at a time when I can't do something right away either. It's not like my day is full of leisure. And when that happens, I've got a lot of time to immediately go journal or sit out by the lake or, but I will just kind of monitor it for a while. It's rare, I would say, that they just go away on their own by my bringing that consciousness to it. Generally, I need to do something.
Mhm.
And I will often, for me, like getting away from my house is helpful. So I'll just get into my car. I live pretty close to Lake Michigan. I'll drive to one of the parks, sit in the parking lot with my notebook for a little bit and do that diagram that I was describing, or do a little bit of writing. I always write at the top MBS writing so that I don't mix it up with my professional writing, because my MBS writing can be more of a rant, or, she said that and he did this, and, why am I so oppressed? That kind of thing. But sometimes I'll have moments of genuine insight in that too. Like I've actually saved pieces of those writings because I'm like, oh, that's what that was about all along. Maybe I could use that in a story someday. So it's a mix of things. There's a lot that happens in that. Sometimes I'll just put a timer on it. I'll say, I know I don't want to do this, but I'm just going to do it for 20 minutes. And at 20 minutes, I'm going to stop no matter where I am and move on with what I'm doing, what I need to do today. And sometimes I will just sit quietly. I'll go to some place where I can just be alone for a little bit, and I'll do one of those visualization exercises I described. Those things don't always get me over my headache right away. But I always feel calmer because of doing them. And I think they lead to my headache going away. So I can't say, in the same way, I can't say that everybody will have the lightning bolt experience where they get better starting that moment. I don't necessarily get rid of the headache in that moment, but I feel like it's the start of it. And then there's a little meandering path that might involve my going and taking some Tic Tacs, might involve my going and taking the actual Advil, eating something, sitting down for a little bit a while and doing something that's kind of gentle and mindless, reading something that's not the newspaper, and not the news feed on my phone. Just like it's like I have to get off of whatever the current is that I'm on, take a little step off to the side. That seems to be one thing that's always a constant. It might vary in what that is.
Yeah. And so the initial signal, what feels like a migraine, is, it's a sign from somewhere that something needs to happen. And your initial response is that panic response, which is almost everybody's initial response, but you've learned enough to know that you can bring that down quickly. And so now it's kind of like a knock on the door, whereas maybe in the past it was like your brain was bringing a sledgehammer. It's like, hey, I got something to tell you. But it turned out like there was never a sledgehammer, but it felt like that.
I was afraid of a sledgehammer, even when one didn't exist.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great way of putting it. It's as if, also the other thing that I would do is I would run away from the sledgehammer at the door. Mm-hmm. And now instead I'm like, oh, I can just open it up a little bit and see who's there. Mm-hmm. See how scary it is. Oh, okay. There's that. Actually, I'm going to close the door right now because I don't want to deal with that, or I don't have time with that. But now I know a little bit. I can take another step a little bit later. Or, there's wisdom in every cell of our body. So it could be sometimes that it doesn't maybe even have so much to do with what I put on a piece of paper. It has to do with my having turned and looked at it dead on for a minute. And then my body's calm enough to do that work in other cells of my body. It's not necessarily happening all from my prefrontal cortex. It's happening in other parts of me that are doing that healing.
Yeah. And sometimes like there's something to be learned. Like sometimes, you get into a place where like you jot some things down, and then sometimes there's something really important in there. Other times I hear you say it's about just like taking a breath and stepping back, even if it's not in that moment. Maybe it's later that night or 3 days later, but this becomes a signal that that maybe you just need a breath or a little bit of space, and you've figured out ways to, over time, like again, not necessarily in that moment, but you can respond to it and say like, I'm just going to go for a walk or a drive, or just close my eyes for a second.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I do feel badly in a way, because I feel as though I'd let my prefrontal cortex, this sort of the rational side of the brain, the newest side of the brain, the one that kind of sets us apart as humans, really gave it, I propped it up as the authoritative leader when it just wasn't, and it isn't. It isn't for any one of us. It's one member of a really big team. And I think now it's like, I just let this really tyrant of a boss just be mean to everybody else on the team. You know, it was mean to my poor feet that had feet pain, and it was mean to my poor head, and got really angry with that part of my forehead for experiencing pain. And, you know, it was always punishing everyone for weakness instead of celebrating strengths, and it was just an awful boss. And I think that even my prefrontal cortex feels good that it doesn't have to do that anymore. You know, it's like, oh, thank God I don't have to be such a jerk all the time. And I can let some of the other members of the team, like, let the amygdala have its say. I did learn, I was going to mention this. This is a recent one for me. I heard an interview. Elizabeth Gilbert does a lot of really wonderful writing about the creative process. In fact, she's one of the people I think is doing some of the best writing now about what it's like to live a life as a writer, but a creative person and just creative process. But she also talks about other things. And she was on a podcast with Tim Ferriss where she talked about an exercise that she does where when she's feeling very uptight, that she will let fear have its say. And she'll go ahead and say, well, okay, just tell me everything that's on your mind. And she'll kind of jot down notes and let fear talk for a while. And then she'll say, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. Now I'm going to have you step out of the room. You've had your say, and I'm going to invite wisdom in, and wisdom is going to talk for a while. And then she listens to what wisdom has to say. But it's like a chance. I feel like I do that. I don't do that exact exercise, but I feel like it's a more formal way of saying what I'm saying, which is I give them my amygdala and my limbic system, the things that are reacting to small stresses in my environment or my social situation. I look at them now and I let them talk instead of just shutting them up and saying, you don't matter, and that's not true, and I'm fine, we're fine, you're fine. And just, you know, listening and letting it have its say. And they don't get to call the shots, you know, it's not. She had another phrase in her book, Big Magic, something like, fear is always going to be along with the ride, for the ride. She said, but just keep it in the back seat and say, you're not allowed to fiddle with the windows. You can't fiddle with the radio dial, and whatever it is, you can never drive, but you're welcome to come along on the family trip.
Yeah. Yeah. You want it on the bus. You just don't want it driving the bus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And, you know, so much of this is about listening. And so when Jessica was on, one of the things I think she said, or she had told me fairly recently, is that you know, after she learned about this, the very first thing she did is she got on an airplane. She's going to South America. She had a really bad migraine. And she remembered that I or Dr. Sarno or somebody had said, you know, you should ask the migraine what it's doing or what it wants. And so she like fastened her seatbelt and shut her eyes and got comfortable and said, migraine, what are you doing here? And she said she was shocked that not only was there an answer, but there was a clear answer. And just in asking the question, she said it reduced the pain by about 50%. And I had another conversation with a patient fairly recently who was struggling, and we were talking about that concept. She's like, I do ask it what it wants. It never tells me. And I was like, well, what do you say? And she said, come on, like, I've got 30 seconds before my next class. What are you doing here?
Right. It's the bad boss or the bad parent instead of the one that actually wants a genuine answer that might provide some illumination.
Yeah. And so, right. So just taking the time, getting settled, fastening our seatbelt, closing our eyes, taking a few breaths, and then wait, go ahead.
Yeah. And not being afraid of it. You know, I just think about it also during that same time period where I was going through that healing. I was also literally cleaning my basement. We had a basement that had like whatever the previous occupants had put in it and other things that people had stored there, as well as our own junk. And I was just every morning for 20 minutes, I was going down there and just cleaning things up. It was such a great metaphor for like, there was really nothing that terrible in the basement. I mean, I did find one dried up dead mouse. But like, it didn't hurt me. This is like actually just a dead, dried up mouse, like big deal. But that was probably the scariest thing that was in that basement. And I think we have this sense, because there's a lot in our basements, especially if we've lived in a state of denial and haven't looked there in a really long time. It just builds up and it feels like it's all terrible. But if you just take it apart one by one, none of the individual parts are actually all that terrible.
There are a couple of questions that I frequently get asked that I just want to bring up for people. Before I do that, anything else about your experience that that you want to bring up, or that it would be good for people to know?
Just that it really is life-changing. And I feel incredible most of the time. I'm able to do the things I want to do. I don't make plans for, oh, what if I can't do them anymore? There's so many barriers that were obstacles in other parts of my life that dropped away along with the headaches. And I do feel very free. Doesn't mean that I won't have pain or genuine pathologies or injuries or things in the future. It's not like I'm made of steel. In fact, I feel like I'm made of a more fluid material where those things can flow into me, and hopefully I'll still have the gateways for them to flow back out again. And so it's not like it's a recipe for immortality or never feeling sick or never feeling pain again. But it's massively, massively reduced, and it doesn't occupy part of my psyche anymore in the way that it used to.
And yeah, and I tell people that all the time, that like knowing about this doesn't mean no more pain ever. It just means that there's so many more tools in the toolbox when it shows up. And so one of something I've been saying, I think frequently on these video casts and to patients in groups, is that my patients who know about mind-body medicine are light years better at dealing with pandemic than my patients who don't. And so I've gotten calls from my mind-body patients during this difficult time where they say like, can I just set up an appointment? I need to talk this through. Or like, do you have a resource where I can read about what to do about this? But my non-mind-body medicine patients are calling and saying like, can I get more Vicodin, or can I have the number to a spine surgeon? And like really going to places that probably aren't going to be helpful for them down the road, but those are the tools that they have. And so knowing about this not only has been helpful for managing the pain, it's just been helpful for managing this difficult time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that doesn't surprise me at all. I definitely feel that. And I do feel like you start to have confidence in small things working and small things put together in kind of even a haphazard, idiosyncratic, artisanal manner, as opposed to an industrial solution. And you start to understand that those really do work.
Yeah. So anyway, so a couple of questions that I know had come in just to think about briefly. So one is travel. I get that question regularly from people whose migraines show up on trips or when they go to visit family. Any thoughts about things that have been helpful in managing that particular set of migraines?
Yes, the travel one is an interesting one because I'm actually right now in a place that used to be a really big trigger for me. I'm in a family cabin that belongs to my husband's family, and I love my husband's family, and I love this place. It's in a really pretty spot, and we get a lot of access to the outdoors. But there were a lot of social stresses up here that I just didn't acknowledge, and almost always when I would arrive here, it's about 400 miles from our house. When I would arrive here, I would get sick right away with a migraine. And I thought like, it's the food, it's the, oh, I got dehydrated on the drive, and I had a whole bunch of other reasons for it, instead of understanding that it was that there were social stressors that were leading to it. And so I think that it's not different for travel. I think that travel does exacerbate it because oftentimes it is traveling to be with family. And one of the great things about this whole practice is that I've understood that things that are considered happy and are happy also often have embedded with them little moments of sadness or loneliness or other things. And I should say things that tend to be sad, or bad, like the pandemic, often have some moments of lightness in them too. And that things aren't all one solid formal block, that they consist of myriad different strands. And so the work that you do to understand that, which is the basic mind-body work, is going to help with travel too. And so it's not like it's a different set of things for travel. It's that same set of tools. But I do think that oftentimes we think of the travel as being the stressor. And there is kind of such a thing as place lag. I think that's not completely normal for our bodies to be in one place and then in another. But it's one of the things in the mix. It's not the thing that's triggering everything. And bringing that same awareness that you bring to your chronic pain in other respects are the same things that are going to apply when one travels.
I also talk with people about, like, what does a migraine do when we travel? Is it gives us an opportunity to, like, go away, be by ourselves, shut out the rest of the world, close the windows, close the shades. And so I think that when we travel, oftentimes, like, that gets lost, like whatever alone time or decompression time that we usually have isn't there. And so the migraine kind of reminds us to take that. And so I will talk with people before they travel about, like, where are going to be the holes in the schedule? How are you going to get some alone time? Can you say, like, you know what, every day between 3 and 4, I'm going to go out and I'm going to take a walk. I'm not going to be here with everybody else, especially for people either who are more introverted and it's harder to be around people all the time, or a lot of my patients are really sensitive, and so they start to pick up on everything that's going on. And so I frequently will talk with people about putting those breaks into the travel so that there's never an opportunity for the migraine to say, like, hey, I'm going to make you take a break.
And not associate those things with weaknesses, but associate them with being your strength and knowing yourself. And especially for international travel, making sure that you build in that extra day before you have to be in the important meeting. If your important meeting is on a Tuesday, don't show up on Monday night and expect yourself to be excellent on Tuesday. Go ahead and go through the motions of having a migraine a full day ahead, even if you're not sick, like resting, maybe even just staying in your hotel room, even though you're in a beautiful new city that you feel obliged to explore, but maybe go through some of the steps that you would take if you were feeling sick, and just let those roll. And then you don't have to get sick because you've done that self-care without it.
It's like a prophylactic migraine instead of prophylactic migraine medication.
Yes, exactly.
So 2 other thoughts. One, for people who are listening and just getting started, any couple of thoughts about good ways to get started learning more about this so that they can sort of get on this road towards feeling like they are having less migraines?
Well, honestly, I think making an appointment with you is a great first start. It really is. There's something about talking to an individual, and not being hesitant about doing it either. One of the things that before I had children, I was always very hesitant about going and bothering doctors and asking for any help for small things that came up that I was worried about. And then with my children, I learned, like, oh, call somebody right away. There's a person that knows an answer. Like, go and just ask this smart person who studied this, instead of you're like pondering all the possible things that could be wrong with your child. Like, go ask somebody who actually has a really good chance of knowing the answer. And I think that's the same thing here. Dr. Stracks has a really good chance of being able to just give you that little gentle nudge in the right direction. And you're going to feel 1,000 times better for having done that. And, there are other doctors that work with this, but this happens to be the one I know. And this is the one that I'm recommending, but it doesn't mean that Dr. Stracks is the only person. But I think having a conversation with another human being is a great first step. I really do. And then the books are also like having for me, being a big reader, those work really well for me because it is like being in conversation with another human being. Um, but you know yourself, maybe you're better off with a YouTube video of somebody talking intelligently about this, or maybe you have another medium. But I think, again, take this strength that we have of being social animals by availing yourself with other human beings who can influence you in a direction on your path to health. With
Yeah.
a whole lot of people willing to keep us sick, right? There's a whole lot of financial incentive in keeping us sick. There's also a great camaraderie in being sick. Sometimes it's hard to give up an illness because you're with other people sometimes that have that same illness or that same chronic pain, and there's some solidarity in that, and it can be hard to be the one that sheds the problem because then you're not part of that group anymore. So do use that instead to try to be around someone who can put you on a path to health.
Yeah, and obviously there are so many resources out there, Curable being another that people can tap into
Yes, great.
fairly easily or very easily. And then also what I say to people is that there's no one right place to get started. And so I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk with me about it. And you know, tapping into the app is a great thing to do too, but reading the books and jotting down some ideas, and what Jill was talking about, just like putting stressors out onto paper. Or one of my patients like just takes out a piece of paper, writes down everything that she's mad about. But there's no one pathway, which is one of the reasons I love doing this work, is because it's individualized and there are so many different options and things that to do. And so oftentimes the right first step is to get started
I
one
think
way or
that's
another.
right. And also using your own wisdom about yourself. If you've had something else that's worked really well for you in solving another problem, maybe there's some lessons implicit in that you know that works well for you. Maybe there's a way to apply it to this too. And you'll come up with your own little something that works really well. That's the prescription just for you.
Yeah. And then the flip side of that, so people who've been working on this for a long time and I know that they're out there and not having a whole lot of success. Any thoughts about ways to get unstuck for people who have been working hard and not seeing the results that they want?
That's a great question. The little phrase in there that I'm going to fixate a little bit on is working hard.
Mhm.
I think that some of us got this way with the chronic pain by working hard and feeling that that's the answer to everything. Um, so I just be a little cautious around that. I think for me, perfectionism and trying to be very diligent at all times and always moving forward were part of what helped make me sick. And there were things in me that wanted me to instead turn to the side and look out the window instead of looking just at the computer screen all the time. So I don't have a great recommendation for exactly what that is, but I think being wary of the idea that if I put in more hours on this, that it's going to make the difference. Maybe it's a conversation with a different person. Maybe Dr. Stracks or someone else could put you just in a conversation with somebody else who's had something similar to what you've had. Trying something radically different, maybe mastering a new skill that suddenly makes you more, puts you in a different kind of meditative state. I think there are metaphors implicit in many different things. For me, writing has generated a whole lot around this thinking around narrative. I don't know what field of endeavor, every person that's listening to this is in, but maybe there's something within your own field that's something that you've been interested in growing into. That might end up holding some answers to this. It's not an esoteric kind of knowledge. In some ways, it's like when you're baking bread, you're going to make sourdough anywhere because the yeast is actually everywhere. It's everywhere in the environment and just waiting to become sourdough bread. I feel like this is sort of like this too. There are actually a lot of clues to this in a lot of different places, and maybe opening up your mind more to where those are in unexpected places that others haven't found them yet. Would also be a possibility rather than just working hard.
Yeah, I was never a big migraine person, but I would get them occasionally. But since I learned about mind body medicine, I've had one in the past 22 years. It was coming back from Wisconsin. Had gone on a 100-mile bike ride and overhydrated. And so like driving back to Chicago, like sort of like getting an ice pick through the back of my eye socket. And I knew what to do. Like, I'm Dr. Stracks. I was like, migraine, go away. I don't need you. And like, I almost vomited. It just didn't help at all. And so I got home. I was like, well, that strategy evidently didn't work. And so I got home, and I think I may have even taken an Advil. But I just sat and I watched. That was all I could do. And I sort of watched and observed, and I breathed. And as I got calmer, I noticed that it wasn't a monolithic ice pick. There was some texture to it and character. And I started noticing that like it would roll out and then come back. And over time, I saw like that wasn't even too. Like it would go out for a little bit longer. It wasn't quite as bad when it came back. And over like 45 or 60 minutes, ultimately, like it rolled out one last time and then didn't come back after that. But just what you said, it's like fighting with it made me vomit.
Yeah. Yeah. And my migraines are often like that as well. And sometimes I'll notice that there will be moments when I'm distracted, when the headache has gone away. And I've had some success also with imagining I'm feeling what it feels like to feel without a migraine, and then just lengthening those periods. And eventually they do lengthen and I don't have the migraine anymore. It sounds sort of the same kind of thing you're talking about, of recognizing that there are waves instead of regarding it as a monolithic thing.
Yeah. Anything else? Anything else that you want people to know? We have talked about a lot, and we've been here a while. But anything else you want to add?
I just would just say, just consider this also. If you're not having rapid success, don't buy into the whole sort of capitalist idea that you have to, that let things evolve as they evolve, but always keep some amount of faith of being willing to hold on to this as a little traveling question that you're moving along with, and being a little bit excited to find out some new answers rather than despairing that you haven't already.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here with me. I know I've heard you talk about this a dozen or more times, and I know how much it helps people to hear your experience and your wisdom and your calmness about this. So thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Good. And thanks to everybody who's been listening and who has taught me about this with their insights and questions over the years. Every time we record an episode, I'm reminded how blessed and touched I am to be part of this community that's working so hard and in such inspiring ways on healing, being brave and creative and tapping into what we know about cutting edge ways to heal. So as I said earlier, I've been able to expand telehealth options during this time. And so anybody who's interested in talking to me directly can get in touch with my staff through our website, www.drstracks.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can find this recording and all our previous episodes at Curable and my Hope for Healing page at www.curablehealth.com/hope for healing. You can sign up for our office newsletter and you get updates about next episodes and anything else that is going on in our practice. I'm on vacation through the middle of August, but I'm back in my office on August 24th, and I'll be seeing patients and running classes moving forward from there. Be back live for a Hope for Healing episode on September 9th at a special 6 p.m. time with Dr. Alicia Batson, who is a Curable board medical advisor and a psychiatrist down in Nashville, Tennessee. So until then, thanks for watching and being here with us. Have a great last few weeks of summer, and everybody please stay safe and stay healthy.